Here is the sheet that Gustavo has created. Let me spend an extensive amount of time explaining the sheet, and this top section right here is the standard data. Everyone familiar with imports are familiar with the idea of having one field that is referenced. You change this field and it changes it for all of the transactions. The idea of this sheet, and it's quite interesting, is that he has in one row one worker, and what he wants to do is to debit that worker's account in that row and credit the amount in this column here. So he'll debit the worker's account and credit this account right here for medical allowance. This field right here is constructed by taking the words medical allowance dash and concatenating it with this field right here. So let's take a look at the way he is constructing this column description. So we have medical allowance concatenated with D10. Right here you could see what it is. He's typed it out in quotes, medical allowance dot and D10, putting the two together. That's going to be the description on the transaction, so that needs to be within the size of the description field and the ledger entry description field. So he's done this all the way across. So the worker turns in a report with their medical allowance there and their utility allowance there, education allowance there, and their mobile phone allowance there, an internet allowance there, and books and professional equipment there. And so what will happen is that it's going to take and record this entry by debiting this expense account and crediting the employee's account, and debiting this account and crediting the employee's account. Each row is making each of those entries. So instead of having one row representing one line of the transaction, he is debiting and crediting each of these babies as they go across. And so each row will produce 15 or how many columns he has across here. This column is a little bit different. He actually is not going to write an entry based on this column, but he writes detailed entries. He has a little section here that he keeps folded up, and it is each of the workers' trips are being put in separately, coding the organization that they visited. So he has room here for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 or so trips, 10 or so trips that they can take. And this one's going to be different, and that it will go in with an org ID in the entry. So the complication increased. We're going to see the way he has mapped all of this so it goes in. Summary, he's coming through here and he is going to debit 816110 and credit that account there. And then he's going to debit this and credit the account there, debit this and credit the account there, debit this and credit the account there. And then when he gets over to the actual travel for each trip, he is going to debit the travel expense account, but also tag it with org ID for each different travel, wherever the traveler went. And then after he's done with the trips, he resumes the additional possible types of reasons people are getting reimbursed just before he did that. And then he gets to this point and he's at the end of all they need for this particular report. And then he has about 4 or 5, 6 columns over here for other additional accounts if they are needed. Continuing to understand this, he then comes over here in this column. It's the LI code, okay, 1 all the way down at the bottom, okay, for 1 for each row of employees. And this is the account, the suspense account required. It's irrelevant, but you've got to enter it. This is the restriction, and he prefers, and I understand it completely, instead of trying to use any dollar signs to lock in descriptions and causing confusion. I've had the same problem. He prefers to go ahead and map every restriction for all the functions, because he's had problems, I imagine, and I've definitely had problems. And so sometimes instead of using something like the dollar sign approach that you use up here to reference these cells, he likes to program the restriction and the fund function restriction who all for each transaction. So there's the who, and that is simply a reference to the account. He has a mirroring, like everyone should, an ER account and a who mirror each other. And then this is the function that is getting charged for the expense. He is keeping within his details. He likes to tag tag the details by what phone company the person is using and what internet company the person is using, so that you're able to analyze the phone expenses by company. And I imagine there's some sort of tracing back to the bill for that as well. And then this is the flag. The flag is just getting the star. Instead of using a star referenced by dollar signs or hard programmed in, he finds it's more successful to just go ahead and program it out and list them out for each transaction. And then for the transactions that are not getting org ID, he's using this. The restriction is the same, coming straight across. All right, so all that is left is to show how this is mapped. Let's think this thing out a little bit. For this number right there, he wants to debit this expense and credit this payable account. And for this one, he wants to debit this expense and credit this payable. And he wants to use this function in the transaction. This is the debit, and this is a credit, and this is the amount. We'll go right over to where he's got the mapping, and we'll study out the mapping. Now, there's nothing unusual in the mapping at this point right here, but for continued educational purposes, we'll study it all out. So he's using the $sign approach right here, $D5, $5 to pick up the business unit right there. The definition he has gotten by, you click this and then it pops up and you choose ledger import. The layout identifier is over in column DE21. DE21 is right there. Air cells R9, you just wanted some convenient place to find it. I always do A1, but it doesn't matter. And then always I put matrix in, no, and skip blanks, yes. And then we go over to ledger import detail, and here is where things get interesting. The accounts are there in the top row in pairs. We want to debit that and credit that, and debit that and credit that, and debit that and credit that, and debit that and credit that, debit that and credit that. One more time, debit that and credit that. And let's look at the way we instruct that with the mapping. So let's look at his account code mapping, and this is where the heart of what we're looking at is. What I have done is I've copied that mapping, which is hard for you to see, over to this cell here. And so this is what was there in that mapping. You can see it says O21, C21, Q21, C21, S21, C21, U21, C21, W21, C21, Y21, C21. Get the idea? AD21, C21, AG21, C21. That was the account mapping with a comma in between every one of those. Debit, credit, debit, credit, debit, credit, debit, credit. The accounting period was made using the $sign style D6. Transaction date is D7. Journal source is right there. The accountant who did it. Transaction reference is L7, and that's what he is putting in right in that value right there. And then we get to the description of the transaction. The description of the transaction, this mapping I've copied so we can look at it and study it out. On his description, let's look at the very beginning of it here. He's pulling the description from D9 and then N19 and then D9, P19. So let's look at it. Here's D9 is coming from right here. This is the debit description. N19 is coming from right here. The next transaction, next line, third line down is this one, and then he pulls this one. Recall, this is the contrived one, which puts together the word medical allowance, because this is a medical allowance account, with this descriptor here, month and year description, medical allowance report for October 15th. A pretty witty little construction. To understand this description a little bit better, let me leave the mapping and go to my little recap I've made of this. He's pulling for the debit to this account, O21, which is the expense account. He's pulling D29. And for the employees payable, N19. And then for the expense account, he's pulling D9. For the employee payable, he pulls P19. So you can see how witty this is, because now the employee account is getting this description going in, so the employee knows what's getting paid. and the expense account is getting this description pulled in. And so that's the way he's managing descriptions for his debit and his credit. Just to take a peek at that again. This is the debit and the credit, and the debit and the credit, and the debit and the credit. And so each of these fields are lining up in this way. So this is the account being debited, this is the description, this is where it's finding out whether it's a debit or credit, this is where it's finding out if it's the function, restriction, org ID, flag details, and so forth. Now don't get confused, this is just a recap page I've made that has broken apart the very complex and sort of hard to follow mapping over in the ledger import mapping. And so we'll go back and look at that. So he has mapped these with commas separating every column, and the description with commas separating every description that goes with every column, and then debit credit marker with it being mapped, and P, we're at this now, debit credit marker is P5, P6, and we can look over here and the mapping is just picking this up right there all the way across. He has debit and credit marker is P5, P6, and it goes right across here, P5, P6, and 5, and 6. Okay, so it's a little hard to see what I'm talking about here, but it looks like he just used P5, P6 over and over again just to get it going. He's got P5 is a debit, P6 is a credit. He just has grabbed P5 and P6, P5 and P6, P5 and P6. And pretty slick, huh? That's the way he's telling it whether it's a debit or credit. And then we have just a few more to look at, but here he's got D21 all the way across for every one of the debits and credits, and he has DG21 all the way across to map the fund, function, restriction, and so forth. DO21 is doing the L6, and then L8, the org ID, is a little bit tricky, and we'll go look at that. And then finally, and the details are mapped across. And so for every one of these commas, he has the exact same number of commas in every one of these cells that have multiple things. So every one of these have the exact same number of commas, and it forms a mental matrix, which is summarized over in this sheet that we're looking at right over here. This is just a recap so you can see it easier. Each of those fields would have that with commas in between, and that with commas in between, and this with commas in between. Over in org ID, you could see that he's picking up the same org ID for all of them except for that one right there. And once he gets here, you could see that he is over in this columns are where he has those trips that the people are making, and he wants to code where they went. This is the debit, and then the org ID is right over there beside the transaction. So he's an AD21 picks up AC21, and AG21 picks up from column AF21. Could make this as complex as you want. You basically build a spreadsheet like we've been looking at, like this, and then you take that construction and come up with what would be a matrix of the relationships of the accounts that you want debited and credited, and the descriptions that you want attached to the debit and credit, what accounts, the fact it's a debit credit, and then the analysis codes that you want, and then the amount. And we'll take a peek at that amount, and then we will be done. Just the final one to look at is the amount, and that's right there. Each amount for the debit and the credit is being picked up from the columns. The first one, we can just take a look at the first one, and the amount is getting repeated twice because the debit and the credit are for the same amount. So we're over in the very first column, we pick up N21 and N21 for the debit and the credit. P21, the debit and the credit. R21 for the debit and the credit. Summarized on this sheet over here. N21, N21, P21, P21. So the same cell is being picked up for the debit, and it's being picked up for the credit. Picked up for the debit, pick up for the credit. Then this cell being picked up for the debit, the credit. This number is being picked up for the debit and the credit. In order to keep yourself straight, you might actually think about doing a mapping like I've done in this recap of what Gustavo did, just to make sure that you're getting the cells exactly right. And you know that you can take this, I think if you're real slick, you can take this and convert it to comma separated cells anyway, maybe in some sort of weird cut and paste, but that's beyond the scope. That is Gustavo's little invention. A couple downsides that he has observed is that when you do that mapping, let me reopen the mapping here real quick. when you do the mapping, you're limited to 256 characters in this cell. So for some reason, when they programmed it, they didn't realize that we were going to get so carried away, but you cannot put more than 256 characters in one of these definitions. And so I'm wondering some workarounds may be to, instead of putting in cell references, put in name cells. I'm not sure that would work. Name your cells A, B, C, D, E, and F. I don't know. Pretty soon you get up to 2 digits anyway. There would be some value, but you wouldn't get a lot. You just can't go more than 256 in this. Another interesting workaround I'd love to see someone trying is the idea of stringing together multiple imports in one overall import. So let me show you what I mean. Gustavo has this button here that imports it, so when it is done, it runs the Q&A macro. Look at that, macro builder, and I'm sure we can sort of take a look at this. And so this is his import that he has made. So it recalculate range and run data send. And the import that he is importing is the payroll import 01. I'm wondering if in this environment you could string together multiple imports that will give the user the appearance of one import, but in fact is 2 imports. So you can bypass the 256 limit, which is an essential limit on how many columns you can put in. Gustavo wanted to make a much wider one with a lot more columns, but he's limited by that 256 character limitation. And so I'm wondering if he could actually make 2 data sends, one that runs right after the other. Or if they won't run one right after the other, he could import 1, import 2 separate buttons to push, do 1, then finish up the project with doing 2 to take care of the columns that didn't fit in the first import. To remind you of the limitation, just in case you didn't quite understand it, is essentially a limitation on the number of columns, but it's not defined by the limitation on the number of columns. It is defined by the limitation on the number of characters you can have in this field right here. Once you get over 256 characters describing this field, it won't work. De facto a limit to the number of columns you can get imported in, debits and credits. But 256, that's still a good many. You can still get a good many in within 256 characters in this field here. I think if I understand Gustavo's explanation to me correctly, is that this report here, but he's got about 23 columns, and he says this is pretty close to the max of the number you could fit in, given that other constraint of putting in 256 characters in the descriptor field. Well, I hope this is useful to somebody, and I would love some feedback if you have found it was useful to you.